yeah, this project is based on some research that I've been working on for the last 2 or 3 years. And I should mention that this project, I've had the pleasure of working with nearly 10 different undergraduate student research assistants with me. Several of them I think are going to be on the call. And so if I happen to notice them pop up, I will be sure to introduce them because they've been really vital to the work that we've been doing on this project. So let me just go ahead and blast off and get right into it. And I always hesitate to start talks with quotes, but I think it's kind of apropos of the moment when we're trying to wrestle with our own history and see where we go from here, but keeping in mind, being very cognizant of the fact that our history plays very importantly in our present and in fact in our future. It's hard to start from a geographic position in the South. It's hard to start a talk without the kind of the requisite Faulkner quote, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And this is something that I think we see very seriously playing out in the debates over Confederate statues and all the naming of this, how the past kind of reverberates in the present and has an important influence on kind of the future and where we're going. I see many of my former students, if you know me, you know I also have trouble getting started on any kind of talk without quoting Karl Marx. So here you have it. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. And I really love this last line that often gets lopped off of this quote. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And I think that James Baldwin really gets at the nightmarish scenario when we can't get out of this loop of our history. And here's James Baldwin's quote from Blues for Mr. Charlie. He writes, "What is ghastly and really almost hopeless in our racial situation is that the crimes we have committed are so great and so unspeakable that the acceptance of this knowledge would lead literally to madness. The human being then, in order to protect himself, closes his eyes, compulsively repeats his crimes, and enters a spiritual darkness which no one can describe." And I hope that the work that we're doing that's happening nationally, indeed internationally, towards racial justice can try to kind of help us move beyond the compulsive repeating of this ghastly history. And so that's kind of where I historically couch the work that I'm doing. And so let me then switch, and I'm going to keep this talk mostly with images, mostly maps. I am a geographer. I'll try to keep the text to a minimum. But this is a map that was made by some actually sociologists at the University of Virginia based on 2010 census data. He and his team put 310 million dots on this interactive map, and you can kind of zoom in and out to get a sense of the racial geography of the country we live in. And as you zoom in to specific places, here's New York City. You notice that we think of New York as an incredibly kind of diverse, multiracial, multicultural place. But at the end of the day, literally, most people return to apartments or houses that are in neighborhoods that are populated mostly by people that look like themselves. You can see this pattern repeat itself in Chicago, statistically speaking, one of the most segregated cities in the country. You can see this play out in Detroit. This line is, let me see if I can get my laser pointer here. This line right here is 8 Mile Road. It divides the city from the county, and it divides the white county to the north from the largely black city to the south. And here, I know lots of people are tuning in from around the country, but I think most of the people on this call are from Hampton Roads. This is Hampton Roads region, and though our population is not so densely populated as New York or Chicago, it is kind of equally segregated. And just for reference, I've put in the roads so we can kind of see where we are. I am sitting on the campus of Christopher Newport University, right up here. It's a mostly residential, primarily white institution, which is the reason you can see that census tract looking like that right there. So what I want to try, and I think a lot of times we assume that the racial geography that we kind of live within today is accidental or coincidental or somehow natural. We hear things like, birds of a feather flock together. We hear tropes of kind of freedom and free will, and nobody limits where you want to move. If you want to move, you can go live wherever you want. The laws were changed years ago, and I want to make the argument that our segregated landscapes were actively produced. They were not accidental, coincidental, or they're not kind of naturally occurring, and they have really serious ongoing consequences. And so to do that, I want to talk, basically try to answer two questions. One is the historical question: how did it get this way? How were American cities actively segregated? And then I want to look especially at the second question, in which is a lot of my research, my field research is based on kind of the human toll of persistent racial segregation now well into the 21st century. So let's answer the first question first. And so you're kind of entering the historical part of this talk. How did it get this way? Well, it got this way largely through racist federal governmental policies. We've now, since about a decade ago, these maps, these famous infamous redlining maps were discovered in the National Archives and digitized. And we've started to see these more and more. In fact, one of these redlining maps from the city of Richmond, Virginia, was on the front page of the last Saturday's New York Times. What we've seen, these redlining maps, and it's really important, I think, to understand what these maps are and what they're not, because they're not literal lines of racial segregation. These were what were called residential security maps. They were produced in towards the end of the Great Depression for about 250 cities around the country. And this was part of a New Deal program to insure mortgages and to refinance houses or refinance mortgages that were at threat of foreclosure because of the Great Depression. And so these teams of what they called raters would go out and they would rate neighborhoods in urban areas all over the country, about the 250 largest cities in the country. Raters would go out and, based on a whole number of different factors, would classify neighborhoods into first, second, third, or fourth grade neighborhoods. The top two categories were most likely to receive favorable refinancing and favorable insurance, mortgage insurance. In the fourth grade, these were neighborhoods that were prohibited from getting this favorable treatment during the Great Depression. And though they actually did collect lots and lots of data on every single neighborhood, it was kind of like a credit report for a neighborhood. They collected data on housing stock, they collected data on the average incomes of the folks who lived there, the age of the housing stock, whether it was hilly or flat, all kinds of data. But as we'll see in a second, they also collected data on race. You can run a regression analysis on this. Race was the single most important determining factor in whether a neighborhood was placed in this lowest red colored rating, the fourth grade rating, or not. So I'm going to focus in on, we're going to zoom in here. This is Newport News is on the left of this map, and Hampton is on the right of this map. And if we enlarge this, we can also see that this is the Greater Hilton Social Justice Group. There is Greater Hilton on the map. Let me blow it up there. It's an inset map. You can see that it's an insert. So it kind of, in the map, it seems to hover over Hampton. But this is actually, as you can see, there's Hilton Village, Rivermont, South Rivermont. You can see the streets of Hilton Village right here. And so Hilton Village made the 1940 redlining map of Greater Norfolk. And here's what I was talking about, the data sheets that were every single neighborhood. In the case of Greater Norfolk, there were 96 neighborhoods rated. Every single one of these neighborhoods has a data sheet that looks like this. And I'll blow it up here. You can see they collected basic demographic information, including the number of foreign families, what nationalities, the percent African American, and whether the population was shifting or being infiltrated. And this word infiltration is a direct racist term for neighborhoods that were becoming more African American. As you can see here, you can see in the qualitative kind of description of the characteristics of this area, they talk about Hilton Village specifically, and they say that even though it might not otherwise classified as a top-rated neighborhood, they're beneficially influenced by good maintenance, pride of home ownership, and I'm circling that right now because that's going to become important in just a second, and character of the surrounding development. Now, in Newport News, we're in the midst right now of a Choice Neighborhoods Initiative redevelopment of a bunch of public housing that's down in what we call the Southeast community in Newport News. This was a neighborhood that was redlined on this 1940 map. And you can see here that it was listed as being 95% African American. And they talk here, unlike Hilton Village, where there was high levels of pride of home ownership, here it says all streets are poorly lighted, no pride of home ownership is evident. And what we see, and I had one of my research assistants did a qualitative analysis of all 96 data sheets for Norfolk, and she pulled out some of the kind of representative language used to describe A-rated neighborhoods. You see a lot of things like the population is stable, lots of pride of home ownership. The municipal golf course here, not open to, it's a segregated golf course, the best residential zone south of the Elizabeth River. Again, you can see again the stable population. However, when you look at the representative language used to describe redlined neighborhoods, you frequently see no pride of home ownership, but in some places they say, even where there is, this one right here says, this neighborhood has a presentable appearance and some pride is evident. However, and then they go on in kind of racialized language to talk about security and vagrant properties and unlawful entry. And it was, of course, a redlined neighborhood in Norfolk. And so you can see that race really figured very predominantly into how these neighborhoods were rated. And so in the case of Norfolk, like I said, there were 5 total A-grade neighborhoods. All were 0% Black. There were 16 B-grade neighborhoods. Again, all were 0% Black. There were 45 C-grade neighborhoods, and all but one were 0% African American. The only neighborhood that had any African American population in all of Greater Norfolk that escaped being redlined was this neighborhood of Phoebus right here, a historic neighborhood right on the water that was rated to be 30% African American. And of the 30 total D-grade neighborhoods, half were 100% African American and only a third were even majority white. So you can really see how race plays a really important kind of decisive factor in whether neighborhoods were redlined. And again, these weren't active lines of segregation saying African Americans can't live here and have to live here, but rather, and really vitally, this was people who live in these top graded neighborhoods. The government is saying we're going to protect the wealth through home ownership of houses and housing stock in these areas, and we're going to prohibit that kind of favorable, we're going to deny that favorable economic treatment to folks in these neighborhoods. And this happened, like I said, all over the United States in about 250 cities. This is from this is a screenshot of a map from the University of Richmond's Digital Scholarship Lab. They have a really amazing national project on redlining, and it's called Mapping Inequality. I strongly encourage you to have a look when you can, and you can kind of look and see the redlining situation in all 200 or 250 cities that were redlined in this period. So that's kind of the first housing policy, the federal housing policy that contributed to both segregation and the kind of protection of white wealth at the expense of Black wealth. The second thing is, especially beginning after World War II, Public housing started to be built. It was a reaction partly to the housing shortage that was after the 10 years of depression and 5 years of World War. We were entering into a period of demographic growth at the beginning of the baby boom. And also this is a period then there was a previous housing shortage. And so the federal government undertook several different housing policies, explicitly racist housing policies, to build largely segregated Black public housing in the soon-to-be deindustrializing urban core, especially in northern cities. You can see this is Young Terrace in Norfolk. It's currently slated for demolition and redevelopment. There's a couple of lawsuits pending to try to block that from happening. And this is the Ridley Place that's also slated for demolition and redevelopment in Newport News, just a couple of miles from where I'm sitting. And what you can see from, this is an analysis that I ran, if you overlay these little blue dots on this map, are public housing, current, contemporary, modern day public housing developments. And what you can see is that public housing was almost exclusively built in or adjacent to formerly redlined neighborhoods. And this public housing was explicitly segregated Black. Most of it was, I should say, when it was built in the 1940s and 1950s. Now, the flip side of that is what we call kind of loosely and deeply problematically white flight, the evacuation of white folks, working class and middle class white folks from the urban cores of American cities out to the suburbs. And this is kind of the quintessential view here of Levittown, New York. There are actually seven Levitt towns all over the country, including one in Puerto Rico, which were all designed by the same development company, Levitt. And a part of why this was so problematic was that the government, the U.S. government, through the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, gave subsidized developmental loans to Levitt and lots of other kind of property developers in exchange for, I should say, in exchange for including in the deeds of these houses racially restrictive covenants that said that African Americans or other people of color could not buy or lease these properties in perpetuity. These were covenants that were attached to the deed of the house. In fact, if you go into the courthouses all over the country, and if you know how to do a proper title search, you can go find deeds of houses that still include these racially restrictive covenants. And I'll show you one from Hampton, Virginia, close to where we are here. But that is to say, the subsidized suburban housing that was being developed around the country following World War II was explicitly segregated white. And so when you see, these are some flyers from the 1940s and 1950s for some new suburban houses. When you see things like this, a perfect location, close to modern schools, churches, shopping, surrounded by fine homes and a healthy suburban atmosphere, that sure sounds racially coded, but when you see here that it says FHA financed and FHA approved, that means explicitly that these neighborhoods are going to be all white, because in order to get FHA financing and FHA approval, they had to include these racially restrictive covenants to prevent African Americans and other non-white people from purchasing or renting these homes. So let me go back to the redlining map of Hampton and Newport News, and just to kind of geographically place ourselves. This is the historic neighborhood in Hampton of Old Wythe. It's spelled W-Y-T-H-E, Wythe. And this is a front page article from the local paper from the 1990s about a lawyer who is trying to get rid of the racially restrictive covenants that still exist to this day, that still exist in these properties in Old Wythe. And there's that article. And here's a quotation. These are quotations from, and excuse the language, these are direct quotations from the racially restrictive covenants that go in this neighborhood in Hampton. They go all the way back to the very beginning of the 20th century, but were placed in these homes all the way up through the 1950s. And I'll just let you read these. The top, this is a quote from that covenant. And these racially restrictive covenants in Hampton are actually fairly, are actually worse than they were in most of the country, in other parts of the country, because the Armstrong Property Development Company that built most of this neighborhood of Wythe included what they called reverter clauses, that if the racially restrictive covenant was broken, the property, even if it had been sold 3 or 4 or 5 times, the property would revert to being the property of the original developer. So the land, if it was sold to an African-American family, it was in the deed, that it would revert to the property, the house would be taken away from the African-American family that purchased it and would be given back to the original property developer, then to sell again. So these three, I've just kind of given a quick overview of 3 major federal housing policies. Redlining the segregated black suburbs, segregated black public housing, especially in urban cores, and the segregated white and subsidized suburban developments in the post-war years. Those three programs had a massive impact in terms of segregating American cities, and also in terms of beginning the kind of planting the seeds of this massive wealth inequality that we have today, that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in just a second. I should also mention that there were lots of other factors. There was aggressive and profoundly racist lending policies, contract selling. There was blockbusting. There was outright racial terror, especially in the South, as one of the major drivers of the Great Migration northward. So there's lots of other things happening across society, but nothing like I should say, nothing had the universal effect of creating segregated cities and beginning us down this cumulative path of wealth inequality, like those 3 governmental policies that I discussed. Now, so that's where we've been. That's kind of, in a certain sense, how it got this way. The second question, the question that I've been doing a lot of work on in my fieldwork, is what's the toll of these persistent levels of racial segregation? And I break it down into kind of macro or structural factors, and also individual and kind of the individual and embodied toll. And today I'm actually going to focus mostly on the macro structural level, just because there's been a lot of stuff in the news lately about new studies that are coming out that look at these kind of universal structural, the structural production of racial inequality. But I will refer you, I encourage you to go on to our project's website. The web address is at the bottom of each page, to have a look. We're doing an oral history and participant-directed photography project. And so you can see a lot of or hear and see a lot of the material that we've been collecting on the individual level there. But today I'm really going to focus on the macro structural. And that I'm going to talk specifically about the impacts of segregation on wealth, on education, and on the environment and human health. And so let me just say that in 1968, April 11th, 1968, just a week after Martin Luther King's assassination, President Johnson finally signed, Congress passed, and President Johnson finally signed the Fair Housing Act, the 3rd major civil rights legislation. And this essentially banned discrimination, racial discrimination in housing. And so a lot of folks say, well, 1968, that was a long time ago. That was more than 50 years ago. We've gotten beyond this. A lot of people wonder, we technically, I suppose, all have the freedom to rent or buy a house wherever we want. There's no kind of laws or racially restrictive covenants that are still in force today. And so it's, I think, important from a social science perspective, from a critical social science perspective, to think through, sure, even though the laws, or there's a lot of Supreme Court cases leading up to this that found things like racially restrictive covenants to be unenforceable, unconstitutional. Then we have this major civil rights legislation in 1968 that makes housing discrimination illegal. But that can be true, and it can also be true that the first half of the 20th century spent in racist housing policy can, and it indeed does have, really profound ongoing impacts into the present day. And the first is what we call the racialized wealth gap. And let me talk a little bit about this racial wealth gap. What you're seeing right now, this is the racial income gap. The median income between white and black families in the US, according to the the survey of consumer finances done by the Federal Reserve every couple of years. In 2016, African Americans made the median African American family brought home $35,000 a year. The median white family brought home about $61,000 a year. But wealth is, in terms of your net worth, wealth is actually really different than income. It accumulates over a lifetime. And in fact, it accumulates generationally as parents bequeath their accumulated wealth to their children. And in the US, the structure of the US housing economy is such that to the extent that like the middle 50% of Americans have wealth, and when I'm talking the middle 50%, I'm not talking about the folks with 6 houses and a yacht and and vast stock portfolios. And I'm also not talking about the people at the very bottom end of the wealth continuum that essentially have no wealth or have negative wealth because debts outweigh earnings. What I'm talking about is kind of the middle 50%, the extent to which we have wealth. It's almost entirely in the one single house that we own and also live in. And also additionally, retirement savings and so on. But housing is so incredibly important. And also housing prices, the value of housing accumulates, at least ideally, the value of your home accumulates at a rate that's higher than the inflation rate. And so the simple fact of owning a home means that you begin to accumulate wealth over time. And so when you look at compare median family income, which already is problematic, compare that to median family wealth between African-American families and white families. African-American families have 10% of the accumulated wealth. This is the median African-American family has 10% of the accumulated wealth of the median white family. It's a gap of about 170,000 to 17,000. And there have been lots and lots and lots of studies to try to explain where this gap comes from. And I'll cite one right now. This was a study published in 2017 that they did really complex statistics to try to test all kinds of factors that are kind of in the popular imagination, and some of them even get kind of seeming like a little bit racist, like, you know, non-white people don't value education as much as white people, therefore they don't invest in education. You know, or non-white families tend to have more single-headed households. Could that impact wealth accumulation? They statistically tested all of these kind of stereotypes that we have about income and wealth by race. And they said nothing holds up. The only thing statistically that can explain this massive wealth gap is the cumulative effect of housing policy over many, many generations into the present day. And so really, when we're looking at that slide here, the difference between this graph right here and this 90% wealth gap, what explains that difference between about a 40% gap here and a 90% gap here? What explains that difference, simply put, is the ongoing impacts of housing discrimination cumulatively over the last 100 or so years. Coming back to Hampton Roads specifically, these are some maps that I've made as part of our project. What I've done here is you can see the polygons of the red-lined neighborhoods over here, and these on the left-hand side of your screen are the polygons of the highest 2 rated neighborhoods, A and B rated neighborhoods, and they're overlaid with race data for this region in Hampton Roads. And what I found in this analysis is that areas that were rated got A and B grade ratings are today, they were A and B grade ratings in 1940. Today, according to modern contemporary census data, they're nearly all majority white. The median family income in these census tracts is $80,000. and the family poverty rate in these census tracts is 10%. Whereas when you compare the neighborhoods that in 1940 were redlined, on average today, those neighborhoods are 70% African American. The median family income is just a little bit more than half of the median family income of the top 2 rated neighborhoods, or top 2 ratings, and the family poverty rate is 2.5 times higher than the family poverty rate of the higher neighborhoods. You can see that on the map here. This is comparing the census tract by percent African American. Here it's comparing census tract by poverty rate. And so any place on the map that has the lighter or darker red has a 15% or higher poverty rate. That's above the national average. And the grayish blue is below the national average. And what you can see here is the neighborhoods that receive the highest rating, all of them have below the national average poverty rates. And neighborhoods that were redlined, almost all of them have above national average poverty rates. And then the last one here, when you can really see this, pretty striking, is the comparison in terms of home values. And you can kind of compare the home values in the neighborhoods that had the highest rankings to the neighborhoods that were redlined 80 years ago. And for reference, I've put, these are the numbers that are appearing across your screen. That's the median home value according to census data from 2018 for the census tract that is underneath these either green, blue, or red-lined neighborhoods. And what you could see is neighborhoods that had the highest rating are almost all higher than the national median in terms of home value, and neighborhoods that were redlined are almost all much, much lower than the national median average in terms of home values. The one difference is this right in here, this neighborhood that was redlined in 1940s. There was, in the 1950s and 60s in Hampton, there was an aggressive program to remove all African Americans from this neighborhood, and it is now one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Norfolk. It's the one part of the neighborhood of Ghent, and it was the site of an aggressive removal of African American families and households in the 1950s and 1960s. And I mentioned earlier that there's some public housing that's going to be redeveloped, and that housing is happening right here in this area, just a couple blocks over from what is now today one of the most valuable real estate markets in Norfolk, which has a lot of people really nervous of when we're talking about removing public housing, quote unquote, temporarily moving people out of those areas and building in its place private mixed income housing. The track record for these kinds of urban redevelopment plans around the country is not great. Almost always, when you look back 10, 15, 20 years out, the populations have been completely displaced. And to the extent that there is economic growth in these kinds of neighborhoods, it's not because the population that was there before is all of a sudden doing much better. It's almost entirely because the population has been displaced and been kind of replaced by a gentrifying class. I feel like I have a little bit more, but I'm always a little bit weird, like talking into my screen, and I don't know if people. I guess I'll just chug on, and people can put questions in the chat. But I'm actually pretty close to being done with my slides. I should make a quick mention that. These kinds of, even though the Fair Housing Act passed now more than 50 years ago, there's still what we call modern day redlining, and it's essentially where banks give higher, there's lots of different ways that this works, but essentially banks give higher mortgage rates and higher rates of subprime mortgages to folks who are purchasing homes in primarily non-white areas. And if you think about the difference between like a 3.5% interest rate and a 6% interest rate, over the life of a 30-year mortgage, that's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars that banks are charging minority home borrowers, even when they have the same credit scores and the same kind of credit worthiness, simply for being non-white themselves or for buying in a primarily non-white neighborhood. and Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and several other major banks have recently settled class action lawsuits for hundreds of millions of dollars. And this is in 2012. I believe Bank of America made another settlement just a year or two ago in the hundreds of millions of dollars as well. And then I'll also point you that there's just recently a study out on Long Island about what's called racial steering and how realtors steer different races and ethnicities of people into different neighborhoods. And this is particularly problematic, especially when you have non-white home buyers who can't afford to buy homes in primarily white neighborhoods. Remember, there's a tight correlation between race and property value. They're being steered into neighborhoods that have lower property values, and therefore this is kind of these two things, the Wells Fargo and this study highlight two more ways that the racial wealth gap, rather than beginning to narrow, there's still lots of processes, social processes that are happening that are continuing to push it apart. That's all I'll say right now on economics and kind of the creation of the racial wealth gap. However, I will say also, kind of turning to education very briefly, in most places in this country, in most municipalities, in most states, I know there are some exceptions, but in most places, local property taxes fund local public schools. And if you're thinking here about this slide and the vast gulf between minority neighborhoods with low property values and primarily white neighborhoods with high property values, it's the direct result of a century of racist housing policies. And then you imagine that that's how we're going to be funding our schools. It should be no surprise then that this is according to the Washington Post, just a report that came out last year, the $23 billion racial funding gap for schools. I'll read two sentences. The funding gap is largely the result of the reliance on property taxes as a primary source of funding for schools. Communities in overwhelmingly white areas tend to be wealthier, and school districts' ability to raise money depends on the value of local property and the ability of residents to pay higher taxes. Overwhelmingly white school districts receive $23 billion more than predominantly non-white school districts in state and local funding in 2016, despite serving roughly the same number of children. That's a $23 billion gap per year between primarily white schools and primarily non-white schools. And so it kind of, it calls into question, I think, this idea of education as the great equalizer. And it really kind of gives me pause about the idea of education as a kind of educational system as the creation of some kind of meritocracy. I think that's deeply problematic and needs to be closely examined. And finally, moving into kind of health and environmental questions. These are two reports from Berkeley. This is the same doctor ran these two studies about a year apart, looking at asthma rates and premature births and comparing the contemporary health data in Berkeley, San Francisco, and Oakland to the redlining maps of those areas. That kind of these and lots of other studies have started to look at the intersection of redlining maps, and that's kind of redlining maps as a stand-in for, as a material stand-in, an artifact for the broad cumulative effect of racist housing policies. But looking at the correlations between kind of racist geographies, racist urban geographies, and the environment and health. We've seen lots of these looking at sea level rise and flooding. And then, like I said, the New York Times just ran this really wonderful piece on urban heat, finding that nationally, there's a 6 degree Fahrenheit on average, a 6 degree Fahrenheit difference between the neighborhoods that were redlined 80 years ago and neighborhoods that received the highest rating. The New York Times wrote about this study, and they focus on Richmond, but the study itself that was just published last month in the journal Climate looked at 108 cities around the country. And I've an acquaintance of the guy who did the study. He's based at the Science Museum of Virginia. And I asked him if he would share some of the data that he used, and I recreated the maps that were featured in the New York Times. I recreated them for Hampton Roads. And what you can see here is you're looking on the left at the highest two ratings of neighborhoods from that 1940 redlining map, and on the right, the redlined neighborhoods. And when you compare, this is impervious surfaces, and then compare that to tree canopy. And you can see impervious surfaces are higher in redline neighborhoods. Tree canopy is significantly higher in green and blue neighborhoods. And as a result, when you look at that over heat, and this is a single day in July of 2015, this is satellite imagery from a single day in July of 2015. And you can read a lot more about the methodology for this study in the paper. But what you see is that in Hampton Roads, formerly redlined neighborhoods are about 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter on summer days than neighborhoods that receive the highest rating. And that's due mostly to higher levels of impervious surfaces and lower levels of tree canopy that create those kinds of microclimates with high variability across urban areas. I'll conclude with just with two more slides here. One is this is analysis I did looking at toxic release inventory sites that are tracked by the EPA. And I ran some statistics on this and found that, and I don't have the exact numbers with me, but African-American population and lower income, higher poverty populations are significantly overrepresented amongst the population that lives within a 1 mile buffer of these toxic release inventory sites. And you can visualize that pattern here on the map, but that is also something that you can measure statistically, and it's pretty shocking. And then finally, the last map that I want to show is another one that I made looking at food access in what are called food deserts. And I'm sorry, this version doesn't have a legend here to see what's going on. Each of these green dots is a full service grocery store. And each of these yellow, orange, and then red areas, these are neighborhoods with higher than 20% poverty rates that are more than 1 kilometer distance walking from a full service grocery store. And that's the USDA definition of a food desert. High poverty neighborhoods that are out of walking distance of full service grocery stores. And that starts to tell a story about the limited food access or limited access to competitively priced nutritious food anyway, especially in high poverty neighborhoods. And if we were to put those redlining lines on top, you would see in the map of Norfolk, if you can imagine where all these redline neighborhoods are, and up here in Newport News where all the redline neighborhoods are, they align very closely again with neighborhoods that today are classified as food deserts. So that's kind of looking at the macro and kind of structural racial inequality that's the end result, the ongoing result of decades, of generations of discriminatory housing policy. I will say, just before I conclude, I will say that we have on our project website, a lot of what we've been doing is not just driven by data, but we've conducted more than 100 qualitative oral history interviews. We're shooting photographic portraits of the folks who we interview. And we're distributing disposable cameras to participants all over the region who then send us back their pictures. We interview the participant photographer about their images, and that all these images, stories, and maps are available on the project website. And I will conclude with that and say, thank you very, very much for listening. This is one of the weirdest presentations of my research I ever given. But I do appreciate you listening, and I'm happy to kind of answer questions or hear thoughts from folks.
Thank you so much, Johnny. And we already have some questions in the chat. I don't know if you can see them.
Yeah.
So we have one from Jen, I think is the first one. It says, I'm interested in whether you have seen any locations around the country take steps to change things, since we've been seeing that gentrification displaces communities of color. How do we change things for the better?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are different things going around the country, different programs. I'm frequently pretty pessimistic about some of the kind of urban redevelopment plans because I find that they tend to think more about the creation of or the kind of protection of capital and not the upward mobility of human beings. However, I've been reading and listening to some stories about what's happening in Minneapolis right now, and they're undoing a lot of zoning laws that have the effect of keeping like kind of lower middle and lower income folks out of middle and upper middle income neighborhoods. Zoning laws that have their root directly in segregationist kind of policies, where areas are zoned for single family homes on a minimum of 1/10 of an acre lots. Those Minneapolis is in a project right now where they're undoing a lot of those zoning laws that will allow for more multi-unit housing, which then can kind of generate that way kind of a more racially and economically diverse population. So I'll refer you to that. One thing I didn't touch on in this at all was about the impact of interstate highway construction through urban areas. And I've been really, really interested in the kind of one result of the pandemic, not so much in the US, but around the world, of removing cars from major roads and how that's kind of changing the nature of cities, and thinking about that in terms of the US and the interstate highway system that, especially in places like New York and Los Angeles, has really serious impacts on low-income communities of color.
Awesome. Johnny, do you want me to read the questions? Do you want to go over them?
Well, yeah, I can kind of I can go through them quickly.
Okay.
This one from Christian. What's the most impactful policy initiative? There's a lot of different policy initiatives going on right now. I think from my perspective, rather than talking about a single policy issue, I think the most important thing to think about is when we're thinking about policy, laws in this country and policies in this country overwhelmingly protect capital at the expense of labor. And another way of putting that is they're designed, laws and policy and regulations are frequently designed to protect profit at the expense of people. And so I think we need to start looking seriously at policies that kind of reverse that and think about putting into place policies that protect people. And I'll also say that we spent the better part of the 20th century subsidizing wealth generation for white people and prohibiting non-white people from accumulating wealth, especially through housing. And so this has been at the root of several prominent calls for kind of thinking carefully through reparations and what reparations would mean. I don't want to get bogged down with too many of talking too much about the first two questions, and so let me quickly read through. Rocio, if you're reading these and you think of you see one or two that I haven't touched on that come up, let me know. Oh, Carrie, I already answered your question or touched on it anyway, about the interstate infrastructure. So a question from my father. I'll answer my father's question about the proximity of areas with poverty to toxic waste dumps. Is it due to low-income people being steered to these locations, or municipalities being allowed to dump in low-income areas? And the answer to that question, there's lots and lots of research on this, is both. Both of those two things happen simultaneously. The low-income people can't afford to buy their way out of these kind of environmental risks. So that's certainly the case that they're like a kind of quote unquote free market steers low-income folks towards riskier environmental areas. But there's also lots of evidence to show that possibly because low-income people don't have the political economic clout to fight the placement of, say, a garbage incinerator or a new coal-fired power plant near them, that those companies and those industries will try to place their new coal-fired power plant or their new trash incinerator or whatever it is in low-income areas, knowing that there won't be the political pushback. From Abigail, the question of over-policing in these neighborhoods, I have not done that, but there's something that some students of mine did a couple of years ago, trying to kind of incorporate arrest data from the local police departments in Hampton Roads and kind of overlay that on a map. Crime mapping actually gets really, really problematic very quickly, because when you map arrests, you're not necessarily mapping where crimes are being committed, but you're rather mapping where arrests are being made. And oftentimes arrests are being made where over-policing is happening, rather than, like if you, for example, you compare marijuana usage between white youth and African-American youth, it's about the same rate, but arrests are much higher in African-American neighborhoods because of discriminatory policing. And so crime mapping, it's a problematic area. It can be done well, but you have to be really careful, because you can end up kind of perpetuating discriminatory practices in policing through mapping, and therefore almost kind of justify the discriminatory practices in the first place. Rocio, are you reading through these? Have I missed anything?
Yes, I think there is one, the Monica, about segregation and white working poor in urban and other areas, if you have any research. It's above Abigail's.
Yeah, I see that. The question is, have you encountered any research that examines the impact of racialized residential segregation on white working poor in urban and other areas? Not specifically that immediately comes to my mind. I will point, though, I think I'm still sharing my screen. This study from Demos does talk about, and I don't have the screenshots here, but they do talk about the kind of looking at lower income, kind of working poor whites in the wealth accumulation across lifetimes of kind of working class or lower income bracket white families when compared to African American families. So this report, I would refer you to that, but that probably doesn't answer the question fully. But I can't off the top. I'll look for some stuff, and if you want to follow up with me, I'm happy to kind of have a discussion when I have a little bit more time, when I'm not live, to try to point you in some directions.
And then Amy and Jason, I think they're kind of both asking for the same thing. If there are any middle school or high school teacher here that their learning resource is developed for teaching about redlining available for the Virginia Geographic Alliance, and that you help with them. So I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, this gives me, Annie, I see, and I also see that you put that up there. Annie is a dear friend of mine at the University of Richmond now, and also the coordinator of the Virginia Geographic Alliance. They do amazing work, outreach for Virginia K-12 teachers with a focus on geographic education. So she put the link there. Please do have a look at the VGA's page. And if you're a teacher, join the Virginia Geographic Alliance. One of the things that I'm working on right now with this project is I'm in the midst of, I'm working with curators and a big time kind of design firm, and we're developing a fairly large museum exhibition. The details of it, I don't want to say quite yet, but it should be opening in early 2021, somewhere in Hampton Roads. And with that, we're going to be doing a whole lot of programming for especially middle and high school teachers. I have some money, thanks to the Virginia Geographic Alliance, to bring teachers from around the state here to Hampton Roads in the context of this exhibition that's going to be based on all of this work, to think about how we can use kind of primary source documents and historical documents and also census data and mapping, and also kind of storytelling, to use that in the classroom especially at the kind of middle and high school level.
I think we didn't miss any question, hopefully. Andrew made a comment. I don't know if you want to mention something about that. Yeah.
A piece by Matt Brunig recently arguing the racial wealth gap is being driven by a wealth gap between the richest 10% of white people and the wealthiest 10% of Black people. A breakdown of white wealth ownership and Black wealth ownership by decile is nearly identical, with 75% of wealth owned by the top 10% of each group. Yes, I think, I haven't seen that. I want to read that because when we're looking at kind of this graph right here, if you're still looking at the screen, when we're looking at that right there, we're looking at the median white wealth, and that doesn't, versus median Black wealth, and that does not take into account wealth distribution amongst white folks and wealth distribution amongst Black folks, or within those kind of racial groups. And I should say one kind of issue that I in this presentation, this work, the analysis that I presented right now, I am cognizant that this is really focusing on white and African American, and especially when you go into more diverse or cities, excuse me, with higher populations of other non-white groups, the analysis gets kind of slightly different and also very interesting. So it's worth looking there too.